Hello students, good morning. In the last class, we discussed about the demand function and the various determinants of demand function. So today we shall discuss the relationship between shift in the demand curve and movement along the demand curve. What is the difference between this? Shift in the demand curve and movement along the demand curve. Now, in our previous semester, we have read the law of demand, we have read the demand curve, demand schedule and all this. Still, to refresh your memory, let me tell you, the demand curve is always downward sloping. That is, a normal demand curve always slopes downwards from left to right. Okay. Now, this demand curve, which slopes downwards from left to right, means there is either some change in demand or change in quantity demanded. When you move along the demand curve from top to bottom, naturally there is contraction or expansion of demand. In other case, when there is a change in demand, when there is an increase of demand or decrease of demand, we altogether change the demand curve. The demand curve either shifts to the right or to the left. So these two concepts we have to be clear today. Remember, this is very important from short question point of view. May also come in long question, but no doubt, but more important for short question. Okay, so our question is change in demand versus change in quantity demanded. Let me first tell you what is change in quantity demanded. Change in quantity demanded means movement along the same demand curve or movement in the same demand curve from one point to the other point in the same demand curve as quantity demanded expands or contracts. So change in quantity demanded means change in demand which we show in the same demand curve. Now remember, when quantity demanded expands or quantity demanded contracts only due to a fall in price, we call this as change in quantity demanded. When quantity demanded expands or quantity demanded contracts only due to a change in price, that is, when price falls, the quantity demanded expands. When price rises, quantity demanded contracts. So that is inverse relationship. Therefore, only due to change in price, if demand changes or quantity demanded changes, we call this as change in quantity demanded. Right? Now, in this case, if price changes, demand also changes. So here, other variables, other factors, other things like the taste of the consumers, the habit of the consumer, the fashion, the technology, price of related goods, substitute goods, complementary goods, government tax policy, all these remain constant. That is, other things remaining constant. If price changes, quantity demanded also changes, then we call this as change in quantity demanded. In this case, the demand curve that we can show here, we move in the same demand curve, that is from one point of the demand curve, we move to another point of the demand curve. Right? So therefore we call this as change along the same demand curve. Here, what we do, we go from one point of the demand curve to another point. So here it is called change along the demand curve. Let's draw it here and see. Let's see if this is the demand curve. Let's say D1 is the demand curve. Right? So this is price and this is quantity demanded. Now, I told you just now, with change in price, demand will change. Other things will remain constant in this case. So, let's say price was OP. If price is OP, then quantity demanded is OQ. Here at a high price, demand is very low. Now when price falls, let's say price falls to OP1. You see here, when price falls to OP1, our demand rises from OQ to OQ1. That is when we move from point A to point B. This movement from point A to point B, each expansion of demand, that is demand expands with a fall in price, and movement from B to A is contraction of demand, because at point B we demand OQ1 of goods, but at point 1A we only consume OQ of goods. So here, whether it is expansion of demand or contraction of demand, we show this in one demand curve. So therefore this is called change in quantity demanded or movement in along the same demand curve. Here the consumer moves in the same demand curve and he either expands or he contracts. Whatever his change of demand may be, this we can show in one demand curve. Therefore this is also called as movement along the same demand curve, movement in the same demand curve, or change in quantity demanded. Here only demand changes due to change in price. Other factors, remember other factors like income of the consumer, taste, habit, fashion, style, technology, price of related goods, complementary substitute goods, government tax policy, market structure, everything is constant. Only change of price brings change in demand. Therefore we call this as change in quantity demanded. But change in demand curve also means shift of the demand curve. This is also called as shift along, not along, shift in the demand curve. Now it may also so happen, we have read in demand function that demand is a function of a number of factors like price of the commodity, price of the related goods, tax pattern, taste, habit, fashion, technology, all these influence the demand. Therefore, price remaining constant, if demand changes, that is if demand expands or contracts, price remaining constant. If demand expands or contracts, we call this as change in demand. Here the demand curve, if demand expands, demand curve shifts to the right. If demand contracts, demand curve shifts to the left. So this is, we call this as shift in the demand curve. We don't show all these changes of demand in one demand curve. We show the changes of demand, different expansion or contraction of demand in different demand curves. Therefore, here rise of demand or expansion of demand is shown in a new demand curve which shifts to the right. And when there is a contraction of demand, the demand curve will shift to the left. In a new demand curve, we can show the new demand. So, price remaining constant, if demand changes, we call this as change in demand. Now question is how and why? Why price remaining constant, demand changes? The price remain constant, but the other factors, the other variables will change. Other variables like price of the related goods, means price of the substitute goods or complementary goods, taste and fashion of the people will change, technology will change, government tax policy will change, then we can say time change, climate change. So all these variables also influence demand. Keeping price constant, when there is a change in all these variables, that also brings a change in the demand. Therefore we call this as change in demand. Here if demand expands, demand curve shifts to the right. If demand contracts, demand curve shifts to the left. So all changes of demand we don't show in one demand curve. Look at this diagram. Let's say This is price, we know this. This is demand. Let's say price is OP constant. OP price is constant. And this is our demand curve. Let's say DD1. Let's say DD, demand curve. So this was our demand curve and this is the price. So the person consumed OQ quantity of the good. Now suppose price remaining constant, price doesn't change. The fashion of the people changes, the taste changes, the habit changes, or the price of related goods changes. So naturally you will have a change in demand. So if in that case the demand increases or expands, now the demand curve will shift to the right. D1, indicating that the demand changes, demand increases. So here, if this is point A, this is point B. Now our demand rises from OQ to OQ1. This increase in demand is due to change in other factors, not change in price, right? So similarly, if demand falls, let's say demand curve shifts to the left, that is D2 demand curve now shift to the left. So accordingly demand contracts from OQ to OQ2. So here expansion or contraction of demand we show through different demand curves. The same demand curve we cannot show the expansion of or contraction of demand because here price is constant. Price doesn't change. Only change is the other variables except price. Therefore, here change of demands you can show in different demand curves. Therefore, this is called change in demand or shift in the demand curve. Here demand curve shifts either from A to B or A to C, it shifts in the demand curve. Therefore, this is called a shift in demand curve or change in the demand curve, because for every demand there will be a different demand curve that we have to show, because price cannot change. Price is constant. Other factors change, so demand changes. Therefore, this we call as change in demand and shift in the demand curve. Right? So therefore, this is the difference between change in demand and change in quantity demanded. So please see my videos. I find that you are very insincere in taking classes, in attending classes, because madam and sir also are taking classes, but very few are attending it. And I also find that very few of you are watching my videos. So please make it a point that you watch the video in the same day when I send it. Okay? Please see it today from the beginning to the end to have a clear understanding. Right? Ajati Thau, thank you very much. Have a nice time.